If this is Saturday night in New York City, then this must be the
People's Voice Cafe!
You know, that was a little weak. Let's try it again with some feeling. We ready? If this is Saturday night in New York City, then this must be, everyone, the
People's Voice Cafe!
People's Voice Cafe has been around since November 3rd, 1979.
Wow.
Not necessarily in this location. We've been in 13 different locations since then. But our mission has remained the same, and that is to have a performance space, a venue, for people who have something important to say and the talent with which to say it. And tonight is no exception. We have a wonderfully accomplished author with us, Terri Thal, and she has written a book called My Greenwich Village, Dave, Bob, and Me, and the Dave is Dave Van Ronk, to whom she was married at one time, and the Bob is none other than Bob Dylan, and Terri was Bob Dylan's first manager, first agent, when he came to New York City. And we're going to turn this over to Terri in just a minute, but I want to set the mood by doing a song from that era. This song has about 17 verses. I'm not going to do them all. I'm just going to keep it to just a few. Your heart stops beating and your hands turn cold. Your heart stops beating and your hands turn cold. Your heart stops beating and your hands turn cold. Do believe what the Bible told. Why am I doing this song? Because when I was 13 years old, I was able to take the subway for the first time on my own from Jackson Heights, Queens. I had to go to school in the Bronx. I went to the Bronx High School of Science. But, thank you. But in addition to that, I could go anywhere in the city for the first time without having my older brother or my mommy with me. And the first place I headed, I was going to say Greenwich Village, but it's not true. It was down on Nassau Street where they had all these stamp dealers. There was a really crazy stamp collector when I was 13. But the second place I went to was Washington Square Park. And I was 13 years old. I just fell in love with the place. The problem was I had to go home. About 6 o'clock when the music ended, I had to go home. And I knew there were people a little bit older than me. I'm not talking 20 or 30 years. I mean, just 5, 6, 8, maybe 10 years older than me. They didn't have to go home. They did something, I'm not really sure, probably more music, and they drank beer, they probably had sex. Just things I could just barely imagine. I didn't know anything about cannabis at the time. But anyway, I fell in love with the music. I heard songs like this one. I went out and I bought Folkways records. One of the first Folkways records I bought had a purple cover on it. It was Dave Van Ronk's. It was the second album he did for Folkways. I went back and got the first album also. I just played those two albums over and over and over again and tried to figure out what the hell is he doing. But I'll tell you the other thing. It took me a little while. I figured some of it out. I was kind of a Dave Van Ronk wannabe for a while. Later on, I went to a Bob Dylan stage and I went to a Clancy Brothers stage and so on. But the first wannabe stage I went to was the Dave Van Ronk stage. And I did learn some of the songs, but I figured out that I'll never do them as well as Dave did them, so I may as well do them my way, which I'm doing right now. This is a song that I first heard from him long before I knew about Blonde Lemon Jefferson or Lightning Hopkins. And it's two white horses in a line, ready? And it's two white horses in a line. And it's two white horses in a line. Takes you to your burial ground. You dig my grave with a bloody spade. You dig my grave with a bloody spade. You dig my grave with a bloody spade. Just be sure that the digger's paid one last time now. And it's one kind favor I ask of you. And it's one kind favor I ask of you. And it's one kind favor I ask of you. Please see my grave. It is kept clean. So now I'm going to throw my first question out to Terry. My suspicions about what was going on when I had to go home. Yeah, as I said, 2 years later, I came back with a guitar. When I was 15, I still had to go home and do my homework. Was I right? Were people making more music and making love and drinking beer and things like that? Or was something else going on that I missed?
Which year was that?
Well, the first year was 1960,
Yes.
when I was 13, and
Yes.
then the next year was 1962 when I got a guitar of my own, and then I was there every Sunday till around 1968. So I'm going to turn it over to you now.
1960, a lot of music, actually.
Wow.
Music. Every bloody night, all day Sunday, all evening Sunday night. We'd start in the American Youth Hostel on Sunday afternoons on 8th Street, which normally had folk dancing and stuff like that. And Dave and I went there. I was going out with David at that time. This is not backing into this. This is not where I usually start.
Right.
And David and I kind of sneered at all the people who did folk dancing. We didn't do things like that. We smoked Camels and we were socialists, but I'll get into that later. And then there was Washington Square, and later on in the evening we'd go over to 190 Spring Street. 190 Waverly Place is where we lived later on. But 190 Spring Street was where Roger Sprung lived. And then there was this other guy whose name I can't remember. And he had a monkey, is the only thing I really remember about him. And everybody would go to his place. So it was folk music at AYH, folk music in Washington Square, folk music at 190 Spring Street. There was folk music coming out of my head. And that's what went on Sundays in 1960. In 1962, we drank and smoked grass. The world had changed. And in 1962, yes, everybody was getting high. In 1960, no, everybody wasn't getting high yet. That was to come.
Anyways, one of the things, and this is not just for Terry, this is just in general, things seem to come together. The late 50s, early 60s, there were reasons for that. But this was not the people from the baby boom generation. These were the people who had from an unnamed generation. They were born too late to have served in World War II. They were born perhaps during the last 2 or 3 or 4 years of the Great Depression. But they were born too early to be part of the baby boom. The people born in the late 30s, maybe going up to the early 40s, and they're the ones who changed the culture in ways that is still with us. I'm not even going to ask why. There are just so many reasons, and that could go on and on and on. But there is something I would find, I do find curious. You talk about the folk music, and there were all kinds of folk music, but a lot of it was based on old-time country music, Appalachian music, or Delta blues, real old African American music that in those communities was already becoming passé, but somehow it struck a chord, no pun intended, with this particular generation. And not show tunes, not cabaret. There were some really fine political commentators who did show tunes. We all know that over in Europe, Jack Brel was doing cabaret style. Not pop music, not rock and roll, but this old style folk music that had real deep American roots and was possibly in danger of being lost. And yet suddenly there was this generation of people, including Dave Van Ronk, and the people who supported them, people like Terri, that kept that music alive. Do you have any inkling of why particularly that type of music at that time? Was it something that appealed to you?
It told stories.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, the first question, which I asked you not to ask because I said I don't know the answer, is why that particular time and place? And that's a whole long sociological and political thing. It was it was sort of the tail end of the McCarthy period. And I think most everybody here probably knows what the McCarthy period is, even if you aren't old enough to remember it. It was a very quiescent period. It was a period in which people who were involved in left-wing organizations were called in front of Congress, were losing their jobs, were asked to swear that they weren't members of the Communist Party. It was not a great time for the American social justice movement. But that had been going on for a long time. That had been going on since the end of World War II. And people, the McCarthy period was beginning to come to an end, and people were getting kind of tired of it. They really were. And as the economy, which had grown enormously, I mean, the American economy was in great shape. Capitalism rose to great heights thanks to World War II. And the 1950s were boom years economically. And young people would just sort of a lot of young people were looking around and wondering where everything was going. So the move toward folk music was kind of part of that. Folk music told stories. It went back to times that were a little softer. It was also promoted very heavily, and I will not spend more time than I should on this. I always spend more time than I should on this. But it was also promoted very heavily by the Communist Party, and to a certain extent by the trade unions. The Communist Party had an arm or an organization or a portion of it that was promoting folk music, that was publicizing folk music, that booked folk music. It certainly wasn't a huge trend. If you look at the United States, you're talking about a few thousand people, a few thousand followers. It's not exactly a mass movement, but as that started reaching people, and as the McCarthy period was waning, those elements kind of began to come together.
It's interesting. I had never thought of this before until you just mentioned it. The economic prosperity post-World War II was real, but it was not evenly distributed. Michael Harrington wrote a best-selling book called The Other America, showing that within this land of prosperity there were very, very deep pockets of poverty. And two of the pockets he pointed out were Appalachia and the Mississippi Delta.
Yeah,
and that's where,
this is where folk music, this is where American folk music came out of, really. Well, the major part of American folk music. It emanated from these places. In the cities, and I'm going to move on a little bit.
Go ahead.
But in the cities, among the younger people by and large weren't collectors. They didn't go down south. They didn't go to Mississippi. They didn't know from old-timey folk music, and they never heard the blues in its setting. The younger people, when I backed into folk music, and some of you may have heard me say this before, I was the child of immigrants. My parents came here in 1921 from a Jewish shtetl in Russia, and from a fairly cosmopolitan city, although my father's family was not cosmopolitan, in what had been the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And they settled on East 9th Street between C and D, and that's where my parents met. They met in a tenement building. They were a success story. They wound up in Flatbush. I was born in Bed-Stuy. Bed-Stuy then was not Bed-Stuy now. People I meet now do not believe me when I explain that DeKalb Avenue, when I was a kid, was lined with little stores. It wasn't a residential street. There weren't any parks there. It was a commercial neighborhood. We lived in a two-family house, which my parents owned. On one side of us, there was a candy store. On the other side of us, there was a row of commercial garages and a bar. And yes, drunks came in and fell asleep in our front hall. And my grandfather had a tailor shop across the street. Bed-Stuy was not a very sexy neighborhood. For whatever reason, and I don't exactly know why, because I did not come from a political family, I decided when I was very young that everybody should have enough food, should be educated, should have health care. And I went out looking, literally, when I was in high school. When I was in high school, I read Upton Sinclair, I read Sinclair Lewis, I read all of the American left-wing novelists. And by the time I was in college, I was looking for left-wing organizations. I found them. There were 5 people in socialist organizations in Brooklyn College, where I went when I graduated from Lafayette High School. And that was in 1959. By going to meetings of left-wing organizations, I hit the Village. When I learned about the Village in high school, and a friend took me there, a guy who I wasn't having an affair with. I didn't have affairs when I was in high school. I was 5'11". I was a girl. I was the tallest girl in the school. I might have even been the tallest person. No, two guys who were taller than me. And this is in a school of 4,000. I didn't have affairs. I didn't have dates. I didn't have anything. But when I first went to the Village, I thought it was going to be like something out of, I thought there would be cobblestones and crooked little houses and buildings. I saw a classic, God, you all know the movie I'm talking about, the one with all the kids. I hate that movie. But anyway, the one with all the singing children.
Sound of Music.
Yeah, it was going to look like that. Well, it didn't. But I went to socialist meetings, and all of the socialist organizations had their headquarters in the Village. So that's where I went. I went to an organization whose headquarters were on 14th Street. And at that time, the world was very small. There were maybe 400 people in it. The socialists knew the communists. We may not have gotten along, but we certainly knew each other. Knew the folk singers, knew the science fiction people, knew some of the jazz people. They were a little off to one side. All the different offbeat groups knew one another, and they all coalesced in the Village. for reasons that I don't have to explain to you. So I met, and all of those, folk music sort of permeated all of those groups a little bit. I knew of folk music. I heard folksy albums. I heard Seeger albums. My sister, who was 3 years older than me, went to Brandeis University. She brought me Pete Seeger albums. My sister was not a socialist. She wasn't a left-winger, but she was affected by it. And she brought it home, and I heard it. I had an uncle who was a socialist. I didn't realize Harvey Swaders was a socialist. He was a social democrat, and years later I sneered at him for social democracy. But Harv was a socialist, and he brought me, he gave me folk music records and turned me on to Billie Holiday, which was great. So that's how I got into the Village. And one night I went to a science fiction party. It was a party of science fiction fans, and these were people who wrote fanzines, which were mimeographed publications about science fiction, or with some science fiction stories in them. And this particular party was way up on Riverside Drive, and I'm assuming that 90% of the people in this room are New Yorkers and know those grand, glorious, wonderful apartments up on Riverside Drive, which had rooms the size of my current house, which is not in New York City. It's a teeny little cottage. And the ceilings were, in each of the rooms, were as high as the ceiling in this meeting room. And they were wonderful. And I was there. I don't know why I was at a science fiction party. I read science fiction, but I wasn't part of science fiction fandom. And I was sitting with some guy who was holding my hand and wanted to take me into the bedroom. And I was very young. I was like 17 in 1956 was young. It was a lot younger than it is now. And this guy didn't want to take me into the bedroom for sex. He wanted to take me into the bedroom to smoke marijuana.
Oh, wow.
Yes, Steve. And I freaked. To me, marijuana was that awful stuff that made you an addict, that used to grow in the fields across from my high school in Bensonhurst in Brooklyn. And I was sitting there saying, no, 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 go away, leave me alone. But we were having this conversation. And a tall, skinny guy, and yes, he was skinny, very skinny, came up and started to talk to us. And he kind of said, Shell, go away, and Shell went away. And Dave Van Ronk and I sat and talked for the rest of the evening. I did not see him. Yes, he was very skinny. I didn't see him again for 4 months until I ran into him in the Figaro. And I was with a bunch of friends. In fact, college was starting the next day. And I remember that because one of my friends was starting to teach math at NYU the next day. And we had been discussing how should he start his class. Should he be witty? Should he be funny? Should he be deep? What should he do? And anyway, Dave walked me to the subway or took me home. I can't remember which. And we were together for another 11 years and 2 weeks, something like that. And we stayed friends for the rest of his life. Folk music. So I got turned on to, I already knew folk music. When I met Dave, folk music started coming out of the walls. It was all over the place. There was a lot more of it than I really wanted, actually. And the relationship there, the city kids didn't go down south. Where did they hear their folk music? They heard it on the Harry Smith records.
Right.
They heard it on the anthology of folk music that Harry Smith, who you may have heard a lot about last year. Harry Smith was a polymath. He was a collector. He was a very strange man. He made very interesting and incidentally some wonderful films and videos. And he collected all kinds of things. At some point, he went to Mo Ash, who owned Folkways Records, and he said, "I'm going to put out an anthology of folk music, and it's going to be the best of the stuff in your archives." And they put out, I think it was 200. I have notes in here someplace, but something like 200 sets of records. And every would-be folk singer in New York City had a set. Dave had a set. I have a set. When Dave and I separated, we each got a set. I don't know why we had two sets, but we did. That's how people learned. That's how people learned folk music. They didn't go down south. Some people in New York went down south. John Cone went down south and collected. Of course, you had collectors like Alan Lomax. You had people like Pete, who knew Pete Seeger, who was the folk music god, who had picked up stuff all over the country. You had Woody Guthrie, who wrote stuff and found stuff and brought it to New York. But the young people learned it from these records. As the Washington Square thing grew, and people were all singing the same songs. Every young woman folk singer in New York and in Cambridge and in Berkeley sang the cuckoo. It was a girl's song. The girls all sang the cuckoo. The guys all sang John Henry. And a lot of them sang country music. You had differentiations. Some of the guys sang bluegrass. Some of them sang country stuff. Some did primarily blues. But it was the same stuff. At some point, and incidentally, not one of them could make a living making folk music. When David and I started to live together in the summer of 1959, when I graduated from high school and turned 20 years old, I crashed in a teaching license because he could not work. He couldn't hold down a full-time job. He just couldn't. And other than music, he tried, was eminently unsuccessful at it. There was no way to earn a living at all making folk music. A few people like Cynthia Gooding, Theo Bickel, were able to sing occasionally, do concerts in theaters after the theater closed at night, after the play closed. Other than that, maybe Josh White could play a little bit. Nobody else was.
Cisco Houston, I believe, was one of the very few who actually had a little bit of a
occasionally, but where could he play? The point is, there was no place to play. Then in 1960, about 1960, a madman named John Mitchell, who owned a piece of the Figaro, opened a club called the Gaslight, and he brought in poets. He booked poets, and it was a basket house. A basket house was quite literally a poet would read. Leroy Jones, who you may know as Amira Baraka, would read, and a basket would be passed either by the poet or by a pretty waitress, never a waiter. Never, ever, ever a waiter. They were women, and they were attractive. They passed a basket, and the audience would put some money in the basket. Another poet would come on, and the audience would be asked to put money in the basket again. Well, there's a limit to how many times you can ask the same audience to put money in the basket. You do it for Leroy, you do it for Ted Jones, maybe you do it for Noel Stuckey, who wasn't a poet but performed, and or Ted Jones. You're going to stop putting your hand in the basket. So the owner of the coffee house had to turn over the audience, had to get rid of that audience and bring in a new audience. How do you get the audience out? You drive them out with performers they're going to hate. What do? You hire a folk singer. You bring in a folk singer between the poets. So John started to bring in folk singers between the poets. You know the rest of the story. A couple of the poets hung on for about a year, and lo and behold, folk singers were making money. Meanwhile, there were other clubs grew up. There was the Commons, which was a large room on the other side of McDougal Street. It had been a stable once, and I can't remember the name of whoever owned it. I have it. I may have it in my book. I don't know. But anyway, it was a large room, and Odetta had opened the Commons, which made it a very big deal. Dave ran the Who to the Commons, and after all, he was doing the booking for the Commons. And I remember one night when there were 12 people. 12 people came and played, and this was when it was still a basket house, and every one of them made a little bit of money. After a while, the Commons closed, and it incidentally was, I think, where the Fat Pat Black Pussycat moved into later. And people moved across the street to the Gaslight. By then, this was like about 1960, late 60s, 61. And other basket houses started opening up. You had the Cafe Noir. I mentioned several of them in my book, and David Brown talks about them in his book, and Richard Brown talks about them in his book. So after a while, people say when you hit the Village, wasn't music, didn't you walk down the street and music was pouring out of every storefront? Well, no, not when I hit the Village. It was very quiet when I hit the Village. There was nothing going on except on Sundays. By 1961, though, clubs were opening, and by 1962, I think it's fair to say folk music was coming out of places you never would have expected it. The clubs, the places that you had were the Gaslight, which was very eclectic. The Gaslight started with a roster of people that included Noel Stuckey, who became Paul and Peter, Paul and Mary, Carolyn Hester, David, Len Chandler, Tom Paxton, when he hit New York, hit the Gaslight and became one of the standard performers there. Somebody named Don Crawford, a lot of people whose names you would not know, and a lot of the people from New York, people who played the clubs initially, And people who had been playing in Washington Square and did not become famous are names you just wouldn't recognize. At around the Bitter End opened around the corner on Bleecker Street. Gertie's Folk City opened a few blocks away on Mercer. And in '60, somewhere around there, a very exciting club called the Cafe Au Go-Go opened. And it featured blues musicians. It was incredible. I heard Jimi Hendrix there, I heard Muddy Waters there. The Blues Project played there, Paul Butterfield played there. It was an amazing club, and I'm going to look at my notes and to retrieve names. To me, the Gaslight was home. The Gaslight was very eclectic, and of course, to me, it was home because David played there. And when the quote discovery of blues musicians who had been known and had played back in the 20s and 40s and had stopped, many of these people were, quote, rediscovered. They came to they were brought to the Newport Folk Festivals where many people heard them, and they all wound up playing in the Gaslight. So that John Hurt worked the Gaslight steadily for about 2 years. And I was privileged, I really and truly mean it when I say I was privileged to listen to John for 2 years, night after night. It was amazing. And to get to know him. Skip James played the Gaslight. Doc Watson played the Gaslight. Gary Davis played the Gaslight. And I think personally that Gary Davis, to a certain extent, is the forgotten great, because he lived in New York and he wasn't rediscovered. Gary was always here. He had students, kids, young men mostly would flock to his home to study with him. People like Barry Kornfeld took him to the Newport Folk Festivals, took him to places to play. He played the Gaslight. He was a religious man. He didn't do non-religious songs, although in moments of this word for it, I just lost it. But in weak moments, Gary would, for special young men, Gary would do things other than religious songs. So that David got Cocaine Blues from him, or Candyman from him, and it was hardly a religious song. But Gary would never say he taught it to anybody. Never. And I harp on this because I am on Facebook, and I would say 90% of my Facebook friends are from the folk music world. So I'm constantly seeing people post songs and post old stuff and post things about musicians. And Gary Davis is conspicuously absent from these posts. So incidentally, for some reason, is Lead Belly.
That's interesting.
He's posted.
And of course, Lead Belly lived in New York City for a long time on East 10th Street.
Right. And I think that's why. Gary and Lead Belly were New Yorkers. They were available. They were here. They weren't found. They weren't discoveries.
someone else like that, like Leslie Riddle, who worked for the Carter family, who worked for A.P. Carter as a song finder. And Leslie Riddle, African American, was later on recorded, late in life, I believe he lived in upstate New York, either Rochester or Buffalo, I forget which town. And a remarkably good musician, was a hybrid between blues and traditional old-time country music, and that's not surprising considering he was a song finder for the Carter family.
Mm-hmm.
And he's also someone who's in a lot of ways forgotten about. And I see Bob nodding his head. You know what I mean? Leslie Riddle, a fantastically accomplished musician. I never got the recognition that I think he rightly deserved.
Yeah, I think it's like local people are just not, you're here, it's different.
Well, I find that if you indulge me for a few seconds, no one books me in New York. But in London or in Leeds or in Sheffield, in Manchester, I have no problem getting a gig.
Mm-hmm.
Why?
That's why.
That's why.
That's why. That's why. You're a stranger. You're an import. Imports are always better.
I'm not the only one.
Yeah, that's right. We know that. We know that. My own foray into management, incidentally, came when David had a manager, and the guy booked him into a club in Pennsylvania. I was in graduate school when he started working. We decided that I stopped teaching, which is not something I really ever intended to do, although I was fairly good at it. I went to graduate school. There were no American Studies programs in the city colleges, which is all I had to go to one of the city colleges. So I was majoring in political science, which I hated. I totally hated. I was also very much part of a Trotskyist organization, which I will not go into the whole Trotskyist communist thing. I'm not there anymore, but I was then, and I was very passionate about it. And I have whole analyses of people's passions as much as I have about the nature of the Russian state, which is what defined all of those movements back then. But that's where I was, and Paul Endicott booked Dave into a club in Philadelphia. David obviously was going to get stiffed. He always did, not in Philadelphia, somewhere in Pennsylvania, near Philadelphia. David did well in the Philly area. He was not doing well there. And it was a new club, and obviously it wasn't going to make it. And we got in touch with his manager, who said, play out the gig, you've got a contract, and then we'll see what we can do. Well, you know the old adage, you sue a beggar and you know what you get. And you get lice, and we knew what was going to happen, so Dave worked out the gig. He got nothing, he fired his manager, and he said, be my manager. And it sounded like a hell of a lot more fun than trying to write a thesis at City College in graduate school at that time, where half of my professors kept telling me I was a dupe of the Communist Party. I wasn't even a communist. I was a Trotskyist. I didn't even speak to the Communist Party, but that's what I was. I was a dupe of the Communist Party. So I became a manager, and I managed him. I managed the Holy Rounders. And one night Dave came home and he said, I heard this kid last night. I think he's a genius. Go hear him. So the next night I trotted down to the Cafe Noir and I heard this kid. And there was this child who was sort of stumbling all over the stage. And picking up his cap and sort of doffing it in some kind of stupid, cute way. And he was not a very good singer, and he was not a very good guitarist. He was not really very good at anything. But he was a genius. I mean, I didn't use the word then. He was different. He was special. And we became very good friends. So Bob spent a lot of time at our house, and at that time he was kind of flopping on people's couches. We became one of those places. We spent an enormous amount of time together, and after, when he met Susie and I became very good friends, Susie Rodolo. And at some point, and Dave and I were running, I guess the only term I have for it was this sort of, we were running a hotel. Every night, people, socialists, communists, folk singers, managers would wander into the house, and they would just be there. We would play records for them. We would smoke grass. We provided the grass. Nobody ever brought any. One thing I got to say about Dylan, incidentally, and I am sure many of you have read that Bob is cheap, and he was, but he brought wine. He did bring wine. He brought red wine later when he started to drink wine. But we had people in the house all the time. And Bob became one of them. And when he met Susie, Bob and Susie became two of them. But they were there a lot during the day. We saw them at other times. The evening things. Mark Spolstra would be there. Paxton would be there. I can't even remember who would be there. And I wrote it down once. And Phil Oakes would be there. I mean, it was...
How big was your apartment that you were able to run this hotel?
It was three rooms. It was 3 rooms. Jack Elliott would be there. Ben Rifkin would be there. John Harold would come over. Tom Haley would come over. And we had 3 socialist friends who were there every night, whether or not the folk singers were there.
The reason I ask is that until 2 years ago, Marilyn and I lived in a 2-family house, but we only used it as a 1-family house, so we essentially had a second apartment. And the word got out very quickly among folk musicians. And we were running kind of Marilyn, you would say a free hotel for quite a while.
Oh, there was people all the time.
And some of them very high profile. Pete Seeger stayed with us once. Leon Rosselson stayed with us. I don't know how many people know Neve Parsons, but she is one of the top people in Irish music. Yes.
Yeah, she stayed.
Neve and her husband Graham Dunn stayed with us, and of course some lesser known people who are really fantastic artists. Like Pam Parker from the Washington area, or Terry Kitchen from the Boston area. And we were doing this for quite a few years, just unassuming, but when people came to town, they knew to call us. So when they were going to be in town, we got a lot of phone calls saying, is one of your bedrooms available? Because there was a 2-family house, and there were 2 bedrooms upstairs. One of them was our daughter's bedroom, but she moved away, so it was vacant. And the other one had always been vacant. And my daughter's bedroom, for a while, we were calling it the Pete Seeger room. And she objected. She no longer lived there, but she said, it's not the Pete Seeger room. That's the Lily Suffet room. Pete Seeger stayed there. So you were all, I admire people who...
People just came eventually.
They called first for us. Did they just call for you or not? Or
No,
they just
they came and they rang the bell and they walked in. They were there. But we didn't put them up. I mean, people slept on the couch. Paxton slept on the couch fairly often, very often with an accompanied by somebody on the couch. Danny Cowell slept on the couch. Dylan slept on the couch a lot. Tom Condit, who was a socialist who nobody here knows probably, slept on the couch a lot. But people came and they left. I do remember one night, and I think this is the story in the book, when Dave and I looked at each other at sometime during the evening, and there were 12 people hanging out in our living room. And we said, gee, we didn't invite any of them. And we went to the movies. And I don't know what we saw, and I don't remember whether anybody was there when we got home. I haven't a clue, but, you know, it was, and people smoked grass. And my then husband, we had bought we had asked my parents for. When my parents started speaking to him, which they had not done for 4 years, but they did when we got married, he is not Jewish. My family is Jewish. They were not happy about their daughter having an affair with anybody, Jewish or not Jewish. Didn't go over. Remember this was the 1950s. It was a different era. But they had offered to buy us a phonograph, and we had thought about it, and we had said we did not want a record changer because record changers are bad for the records. You know, they scratch the records. So this goes to the grass thing. All these people would be sitting around, and I would be cooking or entertaining or doing whatever, or lecturing people on socialism. I'm sure they were thrilled. And David would be playing records, and David would put a record on the turntable, which wasn't a record changer because the record changer would have scratched the records. And everybody would be smoking grass. So then David would take the record. Thank you very much. David would take the record off the record changer, and he'd throw it on the floor because he was stoned, and he'd throw it on top of whatever record was already there. And by the time we broke up, our records really were scratched. I got to tell you, they would have been better off with a record changer.
Was there a lot of music making? You mentioned these musicians, also the socialists, coming to your apartment and spending a lot of time there, and they must have interacted in some way, either with you and Dave or with each other. Was there a lot of music making, or was that just kind of on the side?
There was some music making. We lived in an apartment, and we lived above two ladies who incidentally worked for the FBI until they moved out and were replaced by a guy who put his speakers on the ceiling. And eventually I moved out. Truly. I mean, it's part of the reason I left 190 Waverly Place. He just blasted it. And we were very careful not to allow a lot of noise. So at night, by 11 o'clock, we made everybody kind of really, really calm down. There was music. I mean, I remember nights of Phil and Bob cutting each other. Not an awful lot. There was some music. People who wrote songs, when they started to do that, would come and play them. We didn't sit around and sing together. Dave and I was not that kind of people at all. I mean, he is not a group person, was not a group person. I am not a group person, and incidentally, I can't carry a tune. I don't sing. I keep my mouth shut. totally.
That's
Oh,
that's
good.
surprising. I'm not going to challenge you, but that surprises me. I just had this feeling that you might be someone who at least sings to yourself sometimes with the music going on. Maybe not. Maybe I'm completely wrong. You don't sneak in a tune or two to yourself when no one's listening.
Only to myself.
That's what I mean, when no one's
Only
listening.
to myself. When I was in high school, there was one other woman. I lied before. I didn't lie. I was wrong. There was one other woman who was just about an inch shorter than me, and her name was Audrey, and she was one of my best friends, or she was one of my few friends, and she sang. She was good. And we joined the senior sing together, and she made me mouth the words because she said, I knocked her off tune. So you know that's what a lot of it was like. It was a very exciting time. It was a great time. You said that one of the things you wanted to ask me about was the Llewyn Davis movie,
the Llewyn Davis movie, right?
which fits into kind of fits into my talking about this, because I have never seen a more supportive world than the folk music world of the 60s. I think that a good deal of it is like that now. Then it was incredible. People listened to each other. They did not, there was no nastiness. It's not that people didn't ever criticize one another, but they supported one another. They turned out for one another. They recommended one another. They listened to each other sing, and it was just a feeling. It was a feeling of community.
I have some really good news for you then. I have some good news. Last night, and some of us in this room were there, Joel, for example, in Maryland, there's an organization called People's Music Network. People's Music Network was started by a fellow named Charlie King back in 1977, and a few other people started joining it. He put out a call for people who were doing political music at the time, and this is in the 1970s, and they would meet on a farm in Connecticut, and he figured maybe 15 or 20 people would show up. 75 showed up.
Wow.
And they've been meeting since, and there's now a New York City chapter, People's Music Network. We got together last night at Trinity Lutheran Church on West 100th Street, right off Amsterdam, and we had some talking. We were planning on how to do our next meeting, but we also did a lot of music together. And there was that support. There wasn't the rivalry. There was not trying to outdo people. There was, sometimes you get together. I don't want to insult bluegrass musicians, but sometimes someone wants to show how many notes they can get per measure. And I can get more notes than you. And there was none of that. What there was people listening to each other, supporting each other. Some people were very new to the music. There were a couple of young women who were starting out as singer-songwriters. There was one woman who just, in a previous meeting of this group, her name, Neela, I forget what her last name is, she borrowed my guitar and she sang Don't Think Twice. Now, for a lot of us, you could say, how corny can she get? She was about 15 years old. And the idea that this 15-year-old woman is singing Don't Think Twice, and it's fresh to her, it's new to her. And we were so supportive. She was there last night also. And People's Music Network, it is a political organization. It's not that we have any party agenda. We aren't like, you might find a Trotskyite, you might find a communist, you might find some hippy-dippy love person there. But we all are so supportive of each other. And I'm going to say that you talk about a magical time in the late 50s, the early 60s in the village, and absolutely true. You talk about community. think is so important. But I think these communities always exist. And I think it's just a question of finding them.
But if you're really
What?
interested in something like that, we're having a weekend at the end of January. I have flyers out on the contest. And this will be a whole weekend filled with music and support and workshops. So it'll be really good. If you're in New York, I have some flyers on the table.
I didn't want to step on you, but I thought what's really important is the idea of music as a basis of community is I think that probably goes back to Paleolithic times. I don't think it's something that's just one time in place. The question is finding that community. And you and Dave Van Ronk and Bob Dylan and probably about 200 people are named in here, some of whom have performed at People's Voice Cafe, and some like Carolyn Hester are going to be performing here this coming year. Some unfortunately have passed away. Dave Van Ronk performed at People's Voice Cafe in the early years. Those communities exist, and the question is finding them. And I think that it's not a miracle, but I'm very, very happy for you that you found that community.
It was great, and the music was good. I was privileged to hear some wonderful music. And I do want to make one other comment, my political comment, about the Llewyn Davis movie, which I found insulting.
Yeah.
It insulted the people in that community.
Right.
It turned my ex-husband into a schmuck.
Yeah.
David was not a schmuck. It made him an asshole, which he was not.
It made him violent, which he was not, I'm sure, also.
Well, no, not that either. But it did something else. It denigrated women in a way that I don't understand. It has one of the club owners, it has a woman who plays a dulcimer and has long hair and is slightly heavy, performing on stage, and somebody says to the club owner, "Did she F you to get here?" And he says yes. There was only one woman who fit that category, and it was Jean Ritchie, who was an incredible musician, and that never happened.
She was our friend also.
That never happened. I got to tell you, I knew all the female musicians. I was a pretty bloody, striking young woman myself. Club owners did not come on to people. It just didn't happen in the folk music world. I don't think the male club owners were immune to sex, but it didn't happen. It was not part of the professional thing in the folk music world. The other thing that they did in that movie that was disgusting was they have the Dave Van Ronk character, the guy who was supposed to be a sort of kind of like, but not really, Dave Van Ronk, impregnate a young woman. And he goes trotting down to the nearest abortionist's office, a corner medical office, and he says, "I knocked up another one." And the guy says to him, "Well, you have a credit here from the last one." It's the most disgusting thing I've ever seen. They are talking about a period before Dave and I met, which is the period that was made about. So it was like the mid 1950s. And in the mid 1950s, you must remember, abortion was illegal. Nobody trotted down to the friendly neighborhood abortionist's office. Nobody had credits because they had paid for a previous abortion. It is disgusting. The name of a guy who did abortions named Spencer was penciled on the room, on the wall of every telephone booth of every college between Boston and Washington. He was in the Philadelphia area. And if you couldn't find him for some reason, you really sweated. You really sweated. David and I never had that problem. I was lucky. I was careful, I was lucky or something. But David and I put aside several $100s. We kept it in our dirty laundry basket. And we had an abortion fund that was available to anyone who needed it. And I mentioned that on Facebook about 3 or 4 years ago, and I got notes from 3 people saying I used it. I had forgotten about that, but from 3 separate people who said I used it. So to me, that is the ultimate unforgivable thing that the Coen Brothers did.
And that is just what you did and Dave did is symbolic of the type of support that you're talking about that existed. And real communities, when you find them, are people who do support each other. Want to take a break now, or you have more to do right now?
Your call?
We should be taking a break, so let's take a 10-minute break. When we come back, I would like Laura Saparin, who's going to be on our next show here in 2 weeks. I'd like her to come up and do a 1-song preview, but that'll be in about 10 minutes when we come back. Terry might have a few more things to say, and then we could take some questions if that's okay.
It's okay with me?
Okay, so 10 minutes, we'll be back. I said I would do a few songs from the era, set the mood. I hope this doesn't make Terry angry, because the first song I learned when I was learning guitar was Railroad Bill. The second was Freight Train. This was the third. Tell Bill when he gets home this morning. I said, tell old Bill when he gets home this evening. I said, tell old Bill when he gets home, better leave them downtown women alone. This morning, this evening, so soon. Interlude Coffee House in early 1964, Kew Gardens, Queens, right by the Long Island Railroad station. I was sitting, about 4 feet away from Dave Van Ronk, fixed on his fingers there. Terry was next to me, she doesn't remember it. I just had to learn what he was doing. Bill left here at 8:30 this morning. I said Bill left here 8:30 this evening. Bill left here 8:30. Well, old Bill left by that old front gate. Help me. This morning, this evening, so soon. I said, my God, he's only playing 2 chords. I could do that. Then he snuck in a 3rd chord. I said, I could do that also. 3 I can do. Sal was home. She's baking her bread this morning. I said Sal was home, baking her bread this evening. Sal was home, she was baking her bread when she heard the news that her Bill was dead
this morning, this evening, so soon. Oh no, that can't be so this morning. I said, oh no, that can't be so this evening. Oh no, that just can't be so. My bill left here not an hour ago. This morning, this evening, so soon. This song is in Carl Sandburg's 1927 collection, The American Song Bag. Terry mentioned about the Harry Smith anthology, but there were other sources also. Carl Sandburg's book. Also something called Folk Songs of North America by Alan and John Lomax. Wonderful collection. When I was in high school, there were all these kids who said they were into folk music. They were talking about the Weavers and some about the Kingston Trio, and then along comes Peter, Paul, and Mary around 1962. But I was into the real stuff. I was into the New Law City Ramblers and into Dave Van Ronk. This is before that Prestige album came out, The Folksinger. This is only when things like that were available on Mo Ash's Folkways records. They brought Bill home in a hurry-up wagon this morning. They brought Bill home in a hurry-up wagon this evening. Yes, sing along if you know it. They brought Bill home in a hurry-up wagon while poor old Bill's how his toes was dragging. This morning, this evening, so soon. So tell old Bill when he gets home this morning, I tell old Bill when he gets home this evening, I tell old Bill when he gets home he better leave them downtown women alone. This morning, this evening, so soon. Terri mentions Tell Old Bill in her book, and I have this feeling that she has like a special place in hell reserved for that song. But I'll let her talk about it. Because once again, Terri Thal.
Not anymore. It's been a long time. Tell Old Bill was one of the songs David used to teach guitar. And he taught guitar out of the house. And I was there when most of his guitar students came in the early days. And child after child would come through the door, and David would teach child after child Tell Old Bill, and I heard that bloody thing until it was ringing in my ears, night after night, afternoon after afternoon, and that's why. That's why.
It is a beautiful song, though.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's your floor. Go ahead.
Somebody asked me to talk about something or other.
Managing.
Oh, managing.
Managing, right.
Managing. I don't think I was a great manager. What is the difference between a manager and a booking agent? Doug, you could do this so much better than I could. Doug Yeager is a manager.
I think most simply, a booking agent finds the work for the artist He then contacts the manager approves of the offer that came in. Then everything else, the transportation, how to get there, and hopefully finding a record deal and finding publicity, those are the jobs the manager does.
And to me, a manager is also somebody who helped the artist improve her or his art, music, or whatever it was, which I didn't really think I could do very well. I mean, I could say, don't pop your peas. I could say, don't wear chinos that are so short that they're up here and your socks are down here and there's all this open space between your pants and your leg. I could tell somebody how to develop a musical set to sing. I could do that. There's a lot of stuff I could do. But I would look at managers like Albert Grossman, who put together Peter, Paul, and Mary, who took Bob Dylan away from me, who was pardon me, the term I used then was a grown-up commercial manager. And I could say, if Albert walked into a room, and he did sometimes come up to my apartment, our apartment at night, and I, who walked around with very little clothing on because the apartments were overheated, if Albert walked in, I got dressed. I freaked. I could not talk to that man. Many of you, or some of you, have read stuff, maybe by Dave in particular, who referred to Albert as the Great Stone Face. Albert was an extremely talented man. Extremely. He was a brilliant manager, but he freaked me. I couldn't sit if I sat at a table with him, I couldn't talk. And I'm not knocking the guy. I mean, this was just like, that was him, that was me. He freaked me. And I looked at Albert, and Albert could, quote, make an artist. Albert could train an artist. Albert, or somebody like Herb Gard, who a friend of mine back there against the wall used to work for, would hire teachers, would send people to learn to sing better, to learn to dress better, to learn to walk better. I didn't do that. I took a performer as I found the performer. If I liked a performer, that's what I worked with. That's why I was managing that performer and not somebody else. Who was right as a manager? Well, financially, the Albert Grossmans and the Herb Garts were. They made money, more money for their performers. I couldn't do it. I found people that fundamentally what Doug says is what is the difference. A manager handles everything more. And for years, I thought I wasn't doing enough of it. And then one day I looked at myself, and I was working with all the All-Arounders and Maggie and Terry Roach, who were too young to even be booked. And I was working with Dave. I had never tried to change much, if anything, about the way Dave performed. I'd never tried to change anything about the way Bob performed. And incidentally, a note about Bob and his performance, and you've all read this, or you know this, or you've heard this, is it was all an act. This was a kid who had been in rock bands. This was somebody who worshipped Little Richard. This was somebody who had seen Charlie Chaplin. He knew what doffing your cap was. That was a Chaplin-esque thing. Stumbling all over the stage. That was the Three Stooges. I mean, that certainly wasn't original to Bob, but it also wasn't that Bob was a klutz. It was that he was an actor. And for whatever reason, at that time, that's what he wanted to be. So, And the management thing, I mean, certainly, I couldn't tell him how to change his act. I couldn't tell Dave how to change his act. I mean, I was very limited in what I could do with him. So that's the management spiel.
Well, what I wonder about though is that I'm guessing you probably did, at least with Dave, after a performance, talk to him about it and say, you were a little too hoarse, or you were coughing too much, or you were nervous. On the other hand, if you do something really well, you say, you did that really well, and that's how you should be doing it for now. You didn't do any, because Marilyn does that with me all the time. She'll let me know, if she doesn't know sharp and flat and things like that, but she doesn't know if I'm stuttering too much or I'm fussing around too much. But she also knows when things are really working out well, and she'll let me know that. You didn't do that with Dave or with any of the other people?
Some, but not, a little. But I didn't sit down and analyze and take her act apart. What they did on stage changed. You could do a great set one night, lousy one the next night. It's not necessarily a reflection of anything except whether the computer worked. I know there weren't any computers worked that afternoon, so a little.
I probably saw Dave in person, about 15, maybe 20 times in my life. And there was times it was really on, and there were times it was really off, and you just had to accept that that's how it was going to be. And you hope that if you saw him at a particular time, that was one of the times it was really on. Last time I saw him, it was really on. I forget exactly where, but it was a beautiful, beautiful set. I remember he ended it with singing "I Dreamed I Saw Joe Hill."
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if anyone
incidentally, at one point, David was political. Mm-hmm. David was a socialist. He insisted until he died that he was a Trotskyist. Mm-hmm. He did not do political stuff because he thought, by and large, it was lousy music. Mm-hmm. And to him, Mac the Knife was a political song, and it is. Mm-hmm. I mean, it is. Brett was doing takeoffs on the bourgeoisie in Berlin. Unfortunately, he won them a few years too late, or he didn't have enough time. But David and I met partly through politics. We were in political groups together, and
I've mentioned this. Someone who was in my college class with me at the time. She's named Dorothy Durkee now, but she was Dorothy Bankoff at the time. And she says she remembers taking Marxism lessons from you sometime, or socialism lessons. No,
maybe.
But she said,
I never considered myself. For me, Marxism?
Yeah, she said, or socialism lessons.
God.
Unless it's a constructed memory.
It could have, I've heard that kind of thing from other people. I honestly, at this point, I do not think that I had any business teaching Marxism back then. I didn't know enough. I really didn't understand it. I was a very unsophisticated Marxist, if I really knew enough to be a Marxist.
One of the things I'll mention, my own parents had been members of the Communist Party at one time before I was born, and I have a brother 9 years older than me, so he has some memory of this. They quit sometime right after World War II, and because of whatever turns, and then my parents broke up, so for the most part I was raised by a single mother. Yet some of that rubbed off. I still have my parents' copy of the People's Songbook, which came out under the Communist Party influence, at least. And I remember as a child, my mother hated what she called hillbilly music. My mother had been a jazz singer, semi-professional jazz singer in some of the clubs in the 1930s. She was a commercial artist, an illustrator at the time. And she couldn't stand what she called hillbilly music. And a lot of the folk music at the time just came under that category. So basically, we didn't have that, except I was a rebel. So I insisted on listening to Tennessee Ernie Ford singing 16 Tons.
I sneaked
things like
away.
that.
In 1958, 59, I used to sneak away to listen to that stuff. There was a radio station, it was like 1600 on the AM dial.
WWVA from Wheeling, West Virginia, maybe.
Well, I
You got it?
have no idea.
Did you get it late at night only, or best
No.
late at night? No.
Earlier too, I think. I don't know, it was a long time ago. But all of the folkies put me down for it. And I sneaked, David laughed at me, he sneered at me, and I sneaked away and I listened to it because I liked it. I liked that stuff. But the political thing and your parents and stuff like that, there was a big element of romance in that. Part of it was the rebellion thing. It was a way of being a rebel. I don't necessarily mean for me or for you or for your parents, but it was, and that I think there was a touch of that. Another piece of it, I used to sneer horribly at people who stayed on in the Communist Party after the Khrushchev revelations and things like that. It is very hard if you are really committed to something. It's very hard to let go. If this is your world, where your world is, if your world is in folk music, and for some reason it is taken away from you, you are going to feel horrible. You are going to feel like you're being cut away from something that is your life. It's something, there's something about that kind of political commitment that gives you a touchstone, a root. You can touch it, you can feel it. You've got something that helps you understand this very complicated world that we live in. And that is a bitch to let go of. So is the community that you live in, which if you're in any one of the small sectarian left-wing movements, is a community. It is. And it's horrible to leave it. When I left the Trotskyist group that I had been part of, I was desolate. I was desolate. I was desolate for those reasons. It was like that touchstone is gone.
In just a couple of minutes, it's
Yes.
almost 10. I won't go to question and answer, but that just reminded me of something.
And I could tell if anybody wants it.
Someone very close to me, and if that person wants to identify themselves, they will, was for many years involved in the Zionist movement and had planned on making Aliyah, emigrating to Israel, and went there as a volunteer during the 1967 war, not to join the military, but to take over a civilian position for someone who had been called up for service, and saw what was happening and saw what the future was going to be like. And this was in 1967, and came back disconnected in lots of ways from a community that was very important to that person for a good portion of their life. And in some ways, I think that's parallel. And I understand why there were people who were reluctant to cut their ties. Can we have the time? We have about 15 minutes. If anyone has any questions or comments for Terri, do you want me to call on people, or
Yeah,
would you
yeah.
like to call on people? Yeah, Terri, why don't you do it? Just,
Sir,
Would you
the
say-
Brandeis man.
Yeah, the Brandeis man. Would you say that MAGA world is a similar type of community that hopefully someday people
I don't
will
know.
miss?
I don't talk about it. I don't talk about it at all.
I don't think they're a community.
It's not. It's not something I discuss.
It's
Sorry, sir.
You mentioned Mac the Knife and that song kind of came too late to warn the people. So what do you think about today? Where is the music to warn the people in this country? I think it's way too late already.
Whatever. There's protest music around, whatever it's protesting, of all kinds, in all spheres. And I do not think most of it is very good music. Most of the stuff that's written specifically as political protest music. Again, I mean, I just don't think it's good music.
What's happening, though?
It kind of permeates the pop world. Taylor Swift is singing political protest songs. I understand. I haven't heard. I haven't really heard. So I don't think there's a huge groundswell there. I don't know.
What is happening, and it's way below the radar because it's not getting the type of publicity, not even on the NPR stations, unfortunately. There's a lot of music involved with the unionization movements that are taking place. You realize that there's a nationwide attempt to unionize people who work for Amazon? Anyone aware of that? I mean, there's almost a news blackout on it. Well, there's a lot of music involved with that. A lot of it's hip-hop music. But, I saw you shrug your shoulder. That's the music that is coming out of the union movements today. And these are serious movements.
But
And-
who's doing it? Can you name somebody?
Yes, I can. A fellow who's was an Amazon worker, I think he was fired for his union work, who calls himself Tristan Lyon. I know Lyon isn't his actual name. I forget what it is. Tristan is his name. But that's only one example. A lot of people who were involved with unions were also involved with music. I know she died a few years ago in the COVID pandemic, but Ann Feeney was involved in writing music for unions. Someone who performs here a lot, Bev Grant, is involved in that. We Were There has become one of the union standards these days. So there is that type of music going on. I mentioned before People's Music Network. With any type of music, there's a lot of stuff that's not appealing, but there's some great musicianship. There's some Emma's Revolution, who are also PMN members, and they've performed here a lot. That's Sandy Apatow and Pat Humphreys. Really good. Joe Jenks is a really good person who has one foot in the traditional world and one foot in the political singer-songwriter world.
Fred Gillen.
Fred Gillen, Lisa could go on better than I can, the names of people. But there's no shortage of it. One thing that's happening is, Charlie King. One thing that's really happening is they're not getting the type of airplay. And by airplay, I mean not just commercial radio, but they're not getting NPR, they're not getting the college radio, they're not getting the type of exposure. I see Nora in the back, and she's been working with some groups. I forget the name; it escapes me now. The one who did Shipping Up to Boston.
Dropkick Murphys.
Oh right, Dropkick Murphys, for example. There's a lot of music that's going on.
Yes?
No, there's a question for Terry
Okay, go ahead.
from in the internet, from live stream. Terry, what do you feel about Susie's name being changed in the Dylan's bio?
I think it's stupid.
What's the question?
Can you repeat the question, Terry?
Can you repeat the question?
The question is, there's a film coming out about Dylan. It's based on Elijah Wald's book about the Newport Folk Festival and Bob going electric, and it goes back a little in time and forward a little in time. I am not a character in it, unfortunately. I wish I was. I'd sell a lot of books. Susie Rodolo is a character in it. They apparently make a big thing about the romance between Dylan and Baez, and in the whole process, the one person whose name has been changed is Susie Rodolo. The woman Bob went with and lived with for quite a while here in New York City. And there's been a big fuss about why her name was changed. I don't know, since they did not, as far as I know, consult families, I doubt that her widower was asked why they did it. I don't know exactly, but it was changed. Do I think it was a good idea? I don't see the point of it. Sir?
Thank you. Did the Coen brothers ever consult with you about that movie?
No.
They didn't speak to you at all?
Nope.
Really?
Nope.
Thank
I
you.
understand that Oscar Isaacs tried to get in touch with me, but I'm not hard to find. I'm listed. I was listed in the telephone directory when that movie was made. If anybody wanted to get in touch with me, they could have. No.
He did a remarkable job with the music, though.
The music was really good. Yeah, he did. The music was excellent. Really good.
Thank you.
Ma'am?
Yeah, aside from David, who clearly was a huge influence, was there any particular person that had a really big impact on you from the folk circles that you were in?
Gary Davis, John Hurt. Gary Davis, John Hurt.
And why?
I'm sorry?
And why?
Because they made great music. I was interested in the music. I really was. And my particular passion was blues. I fell in love with the blues. And these people were, and still are my gods. Yeah. I still play records, and I still play their records.
Do you have a changer?
No, I do not. No. But I don't throw my records on the floor. I don't do that.
If your passion is the blues, and sitting in the audience is someone who performed with some of the top blues musicians, as Bob Malenky, who's also performed here.
Oh, hey.
Ken, as a personal favor and as a gift to Terry, Bob, could you come up and do a song? This 015 is almost as old as I am. No, I changed the strings before, I don't know, before my birthday or something like that. Yeah.
Here. Here, take one.
Speaking of Reverend Gary Davis, I'm going to do a song associated with him. It's an old spiritual. I was fortunate enough to tour with Sonny Terry, and he played this song because it was about the first song he ever learned. It's called 12 Gates to the City, and he played it on the harmonica when he was a little kid. And Gary Davis was known for doing it, and I'm sure Dave did it. Oh, what a beautiful city. Oh, what a beautiful city. Oh, what a beautiful city. 12 gates to the city. Hallelujah. Now it's 3 gates in the north, 3 gates in the south, 3 gates in the east, 3 gates in the west. That makes 12 gates to the city. Hallelujah. Oh, what a beautiful city. Oh, what a beautiful city. Oh, what a beautiful city. 12 gates to the city. Hallelujah. City. Oh, what a beautiful city. Oh, what a beautiful city. 12 gates to the city. Hallelujah. Now if you see my dear old mother, give her this message from me. Tell her that I'll meet her the shores of Galilee. I'm right there in that city. Hallelujah. Oh, what a beautiful city. Oh, what a beautiful city. Oh, what a beautiful city. 12 gates to the city. Hallelujah. Thank you.
I thank you all.
Thank you.
And I am going to be out there if anybody wants to buy books.
Sure.
The thing that takes credit cards isn't working, so I will take cash, and if you don't have cash, I trust you. I have little slips of paper with my name and home address on it, and I'll sell you a book. I'll give you a piece of paper, and you can mail me a check. Because the thing is, I don't know, it's electronic, and it's not good electronic.
Yeah, before we go, I'm going to make one little pitch for People's Voice Cafe. Over the years, since 1979, we've had some high-profile people perform for us. David Amram, Pete Seeger, Odetta, Dave Van Ronk. But we've also had people who you might not hear about. Some of them are not full-time professional musicians, but they are incredibly talented people who have something to say, and they have the talent with which to say. Joel Landy, for example, in the audience. He's a high school business teacher. But, you know, you have to make a living. You have to make a living. Barbara Rossica, yeah. Barbara Lanky, I pointed out before. But we have to have spaces for people like that, for people like Laura. I see in the back of the audience a fellow, Hunter Jewell. Hunter came from Michigan, from a small town in Michigan. He's in New York City now. He writes wonderful songs. And it's really important that there are places for people to be heard. And we have to create those spaces because the music industry isn't going to do it for us.
Right.
The radio and television stations and the streamings and the peacocks or whatever they are now, with the Hulus and the Dulus and things like that, they're not going to create the space for this music. We have to create our own venues. We have to create places where we could perform, even if it's in a bus station.
That's right.
Even if it's in the waiting room of a bus station, and you start singing, you don't have a guitar, but you sing a song, people come around and listen. Maybe they tell you to get lost.
Right.
It's the chances you take. But we have to have those places, and we can find community. Terri found a community, a wonderful, a beautiful, a beloved community. And there is still, it's not gone entirely. Terri is here, there are still people like that.
WBAI Folk Radio.
Folk Radio and WBAI, and there's some other places, there are some online stations, Folk Music Notebook, among them Ron Olesko's program. But it's really important to keep those things going. The other thing I also want to add is that folk music never goes away. It's always there. It was there in the Paleolithic era. You're laughing, but it was. I suspect it was. Mark, you have something to say?
Steve, Harry Baya of the Pinewood's Club does a broadcast once a week. I don't know what station it's on, but I can find out from Harry and tell you and publicize it.
We'll go out with a song. You know this. There's a man by my side walking. There's a voice within me talking. There's a word that needs a saying. Help me carry it on, carry it on, carry it on, carry it on. They will tell their lying stories, send their dogs to bite our bodies. They will lock us in their prison. Carry it on, carry it on, carry it on, carry it on. But their lies will be forgotten, and their dogs, poor dogs, I can't blame them, will lie there rotting. And their prison walls, they're gonna tumble. Carry it on, carry it on, carry it on, carry it on. The song was written by Gil Turner, one of the people from that era. One last verse and we'll go out. If you can't go on any longer, take the hand of your sister and brother. Every victory, and there'll be victories, there will be, gonna bring another. Carry it on, carry it on, carry it on, carry it on. Thank you for coming. Thank you to Terri Thal. Thank our volunteers. Come back in 2 weeks. Pick up one of the yellow flyers. Come back next year, and hopefully we'll be here for many years to come.
All right.
Safe home, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.